The cold wind howled as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the abandoned stretch of road. Beneath an old rusted bridge, a small, scruffy dog cowered in the shadows. His fur was matted, his body thin, and his eyes, wide and filled with desperation, searched the darkening world for some sign of hope. The dog's name was Max. He had been left behind, abandoned by the only family he had ever known, a small creature who once wagged his tail with joy, only to find himself cast aside like trash. Days had turned into weeks. His stomach was empty and his fur, once soft, had become tangled and dirty. But the worst part wasn't his hunger or the cold, it was the loneliness. Max had never been alone before. He had always had someone to care for him. But now there was no one. As the sky grew darker, Max let out a mournful cry, a desperate sound that echoed beneath the bridge. His high-pitched whimper seemed to pierce the silence, but no one was around to hear it. The world, it seemed, had forgotten him. Scene 2. A few miles away, a woman named Rachel was driving home from her job at the local hospital. The day had been long and she was exhausted, looking forward to nothing more than a warm bath and a quiet evening. She was just about to turn onto her street when something caught her eye, something small and moving beneath the bridge. Her headlights illuminated the area for just a moment, but it was enough. At first she thought it might be a stray cat or a raccoon, but then she heard it, the heart-wrenching sound of a dog crying out in pain. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She knew she couldn't just drive away. Without thinking twice, she pulled her car to the side of the road and got out. The wind hit her face, but she barely noticed. She was focused on the sound, now louder and more urgent. It was a cry for help, and Rachel couldn't ignore it. As she approached the bridge, she spotted Max, his scruffy little body hunched against the cold concrete. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with an unspoken plea for help. She knelt down slowly, not wanting to scare him, and spoke gently. "Hey, little guy," she said softly, reaching out a hand. "It's okay. You're not alone anymore." Scene 3. Max flinched at first, his body tense with fear. He had been abandoned by people he had once trusted, and the idea of another human approaching him felt like a risk. But there was something different about Rachel. There was warmth in her voice, something kind and familiar that made Max hesitate. He looked into her eyes, eyes that weren't filled with judgment but with compassion. Rachel continued to speak in calm, soothing tones. She didn't rush him, allowing him to come to her in his own time. After what felt like an eternity, Max slowly crawled toward her, his tail tucked between his legs. She extended her hand just a little farther, and after a few more moments, he finally sniffed her fingers, then gently licked her hand. Rachel's heart broke as she stroked his matted fur. She could feel the warmth of his tiny body beneath her touch, but she also felt the pain of what he had endured. Max's ribs were visible beneath his fur, and his eyes were clouded with the kind of sadness only abandonment could create. "I'm going to help you," she whispered. "You're safe now." Scene 4. Rachel carefully lifted Max into her arms, feeling the weight of his small, fragile body. She knew that getting him to a vet was her top priority. The poor thing had been through so much. Max didn't resist. Instead, he nestled into her arms, finally allowing himself to relax, perhaps for the first time in a long while. As Rachel drove to the animal hospital, her mind raced. What had happened to Max? How had he ended up here, alone, suffering? It wasn't just the cold or the hunger that troubled her, it was the emotional toll that abandonment took on an animal. Rachel had seen it in the faces of other strays she had helped in the past, but Max's eyes were different. They were filled with a deep, soul-wrenching sadness. When they arrived at the hospital, Rachel carried Max inside, and the staff immediately took action. He was examined, bathed, and treated for malnutrition, parasites, and a few old injuries. But what struck Rachel most was the way Max seemed to shut down in the presence of strangers. He wouldn't make eye contact with anyone except her, and when the staff tried to approach him, he would shrink back, his body trembling. Rachel stayed by his side the entire time, talking to him softly, reassuring him that he wasn't alone anymore. She could feel the bond growing stronger between them with every passing hour. Max may have been physically broken, but Rachel could see that his spirit wasn't gone. He still had the capacity to trust. He just needed time. Scene 5. Days turned into weeks, and Rachel spent every moment she could with Max. He was recovering slowly, gaining weight and strength. But the real transformation was happening in his heart. As Rachel continued to visit him, Max began to trust again. He started to wag his tail when she entered the room, his eyes no longer clouded with fear, but with a cautious curiosity. Rachel knew that bringing Max home was the next step. She was nervous, she wasn't sure how he would adjust to life outside the hospital. But she also knew that Max had found something special in her. He had begun to see her not as a stranger, but as someone who had kept her promise to him, that he was safe, loved, and wanted. When the day finally came for Max to leave the hospital, Rachel placed a soft collar around his neck and clipped on a leash. She opened the door to the kennel, and Max stepped out tentatively, sniffing the air as if he wasn't sure what to expect. But Rachel was there, her hand on his back, guiding him forward. She led him out into the sunlight, where he stopped for a moment and looked up at her, eyes full of wonder. "Are you ready, Max?" she asked. He wagged his tail once, just a small, uncertain movement, but it was enough to bring a smile to Rachel's face. Scene 6. Max's new life wasn't without its challenges. There were still moments when he would cower at loud noises, or flinch when someone reached out too quickly. But Rachel was patient. She never pushed him too hard, allowing him the time he needed to adjust. Slowly he began to open up, learning that love wasn't something that could be taken away. In time, Max became a beloved part of Rachel's family. He followed her everywhere, curling up by her feet when she read, walking with her on long hikes, and greeting her with boundless enthusiasm when she came home. He had learned that home meant safety and love, and he had learned to trust again. But it was the moments when Max would lie by Rachel's side, resting his head on her lap, that were the most meaningful. The bond between them was undeniable. Max had not only been rescued from the streets, he had been rescued from a life of loneliness and pain. And Rachel had been rescued too. She had given Max a second chance, but in doing so she had also healed her own heart. Scene 7. Months later, Rachel found herself walking with Max in the park, the autumn leaves swirling around them. Max was now strong, confident, and full of life. He bounded through the grass, chasing after a ball with the kind of joy that only comes when you've known what it means to truly be loved. As Rachel watched him run, her heart swelled with gratitude. Max had been through so much, and yet he had never given up. He had found the courage to trust again, and in doing so he had found a home, a family. She knelt down to call him, and he came running toward her, his tail wagging furiously. "You're my hero," she whispered as Max nuzzled her hand, his eyes full of love. Closing scene. The cold wind still blew beneath the bridge where Max had once cried out for help. But now there was no more sorrow, no more desperation. Because Max had found his place in the world. And he would never have to cry beneath a bridge again.